The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Children's Memorial Hospital as a young African-American girl made her way through the sliding glass doors. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old, yet she carried herself with remarkable poise. In her arms, she carefully cradled a fair-skinned infant wrapped in a pale blue blanket. The hospital's main lobby was bustling with its usual afternoon activity, parents comforting sick children, elderly patients being wheeled to their appointments, and medical staff hurrying between departments. But for a moment, everything seemed to slow down as heads turned to observe this unusual pair. Behind the reception desk, two experienced nurses were catching up on their paperwork when they noticed the young girl approaching. The older nurse, who had been working at the hospital for over 2 decades, set down her pen and watched intently as the girl navigated through the waiting area. The baby in her arms appeared to be no more than 6 months old, with rosy cheeks and wispy blonde hair, a striking contrast to the dark-skinned girl who held them. The younger nurse discreetly pressed the security button under the desk, a standard protocol when something seemed amiss. Meanwhile, her colleague adjusted her glasses and leaned forward, trying to get a better look at the situation unfolding before them. What caught their attention wasn't just the apparent age difference between the girl and the baby, or their contrasting appearances. It was the remarkable confidence and tenderness with which the young girl handled the infant. She wasn't struggling or uncertain like most preteens might be with a baby. Instead, her movements were practiced and gentle, suggesting she was familiar with caring for infants. As she approached the desk, both nurses noticed that despite her youth, the girl's expression showed concern rather than fear or guilt. She carried a small diaper bag over one shoulder, and the baby was properly dressed for the cool spring weather, wearing a tiny knit cap and warm onesie. The lobby's background noise seemed to fade as the girl finally reached the reception desk. She had to stand on her tiptoes to see over the counter properly, but her voice was clear and steady when she spoke. "Excuse me," she said politely, adjusting the baby in her arms. "I need to see a doctor. The baby has a fever." The nurses exchanged quick glances. The older nurse, who had raised 4 children of her own, recognized the genuine worry in the girl's voice. Still, protocol demanded they investigate further. Years of experience had taught them that unusual situations often required careful handling. The younger nurse stepped forward, her name badge catching the fluorescent light. She smiled warmly, though her eyes remained watchful. "Of course, sweetie. Can you tell us a bit more about what's going on? Is this your baby sister?" The girl shook her head, her braids swaying slightly with the movement. Before she could answer, the baby stirred in her arms, making a soft whimpering sound. Immediately, the girl's attention shifted to the infant. She began gently bouncing and patting the baby's back with the natural instinct of an experienced caregiver. The older nurse watched this interaction closely. In her 30 years of pediatric nursing, she had developed a keen sense for distinguishing between genuine care and suspicious behavior. Something about this girl's demeanor didn't match with any concerning scenarios she had encountered before. Meanwhile, a security guard had positioned himself near the water fountain, trying to appear casual while keeping an eye on the situation. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows, creating a warm glow around the young girl and the baby as they stood at the desk. Several other patients in the waiting area had also taken notice of the scene. An elderly woman clutched her purse tighter, while a young mother pulled her own child closer. The atmosphere in the lobby had shifted from its usual casual bustle to one of supple tension. The baby began to fuss more insistently now, its face scrunching up in discomfort. The girl responded by shifting the infant to her shoulder, patting its back with practiced ease. "The baby's temperature was 101.3 when I checked it 20 minutes ago," she explained, her voice carrying a maturity that seemed beyond her years. "I used the temporal thermometer, just like my mom taught me." This detail caught both nurses by surprise. Not many 12-year-olds would know about temporal thermometers, let alone how to use one properly. The older nurse pulled out an admission form, her professional instincts beginning to war with her initial suspicions. Just then, the baby let out a small cry, and the girl immediately reached into the diaper bag, pulling out a perfectly prepared bottle. The temperature of the formula, the way she tested it on her wrist, the angle at which she held the bottle, every movement spoke of someone who had done this many times before. The younger nurse stepped around the desk now, moving closer to check on the baby. Despite the fever, the infant was clean, well cared for, and responded to the girl's touch with familiarity. There were no signs of distress beyond what would be expected from a sick baby. The scene had caught the attention of a passing pediatrician who paused at the edge of the lobby, observing the interaction. The natural way the girl handled the baby, her attention to detail, and her obvious concern painted a picture that was becoming increasingly complex. As the nurses prepared to ask more questions, they couldn't help but notice how the girl kept the baby close, protecting its head from the cool air conditioning, adjusting its position for comfort, all while maintaining eye contact with them. These weren't the actions of someone who had done anything wrong. These were the instincts of a caregiver. The story behind this unusual pair was about to unfold, and it would challenge more than a few preconceptions held by those who witnessed the scene. But for now, in the warm afternoon light of the hospital lobby, a young girl stood her ground, focused solely on getting help for the baby in her arms, seemingly unaware of the stutter she had created. The steady beeping of medical equipment in the background, the whispered conversations of onlookers, and the gentle hum of the air conditioning created a backdrop for what would soon become a memorable lesson about appearances, assumptions, and the pure heart of a child who simply wanted to help. The tension in the hospital lobby grew as the young girl stood patiently at the reception desk. The older nurse cleared her throat and leaned forward, her voice dropping to a gentle but firm tone. "Sweetheart, we need to ask you some important questions. Could you tell us where this baby came from?" The girl looked up, her dark eyes clear and unwavering. She seemed to understand the weight of the situation, though she couldn't have known that the security guard was now speaking quietly into his radio, or that another nurse had slipped away to call Child Protective Services as a precaution. "The baby lives next door to us," she explained, still gently rocking the infant. "Their family has been our neighbors since before I was born." Her voice carried no trace of nervousness or deceit, just genuine concern for the feverish child in her arms. The younger nurse exchanged glances with her colleague before continuing. "And where are the baby's parents right now?" She pulled out a notepad, pen poised to write. Around them, other patients in the waiting room had given up any pretense of not listening, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. The girl shifted the baby's weight carefully before answering. "Their grandmother had an accident this morning. She fell down some stairs. The baby's mom and dad had to rush to another hospital across town." She paused to adjust the blanket around the infant's feet. "My mom arranged for me to watch the baby while they're gone. I have their phone numbers right here." She reached into the diaper bag with one hand, pulling out a carefully folded piece of paper. The older nurse took the paper, noting the multiple contact numbers written in an adult's handwriting, along with detailed care instructions. Still, protocol demanded they dig deeper. A hospital social worker had now joined them, standing slightly to the side, observing the interaction with professional interest. "How long have you been watching the baby?" the social worker asked, her tone friendly but probing. She noticed how the girl's attention never wavered from the infant, even as she answered questions. When the baby started to fuss, she automatically reached for a pacifier in the side pocket of the diaper bag, knowing exactly where it was stored. "Since this morning, around 8 o'clock, the girl replied. "Everything was fine until about an hour ago. The baby started feeling warm during their nap, so I took their temperature like my mom showed me. When it was over 101, I knew I had to bring them to the hospital." The social worker nodded, making notes. "And how did you get here?" The hospital was at least a mile from the nearest residential area, and the girl clearly hadn't driven herself. "I called Mr. Wilson from across the street. He's retired and helps our neighborhood watch. He drove us here in his car." She paused, then added, "I have his number too. He waited to make sure we got inside okay before leaving." The detail in her answers and the practical solutions she'd found were impressive for someone so young. The security guard had relaxed slightly, though he remained nearby. The baby had settled down, sucking contentedly on the pacifier while resting against the girl's shoulder. A new nurse approached with a thermometer, asking permission to check the baby's temperature. The girl cooperated immediately, helping position the infant correctly. When the thermometer showed 101.5, her face showed obvious concern. "It's gone up a little," she said worriedly. "Can the doctor see us soon?" The older nurse began typing information into her computer. "We'll need to contact the parents first," she explained. "Can you tell us more about what happened this morning? How did you end up being the one to watch the baby?" The girl nodded, speaking clearly despite her growing concern about the fever. "My mom is a nurse at the medical center across town. She often helps our neighbors with babysitting schedules. When their grandmother fell, they called our house first because they knew my mom would know what to do." As she spoke, more details emerged that began painting a clearer picture. The girl explained how her mother had trained her in basic childcare, starting with her younger cousins. She described the detailed instructions left for the baby's feeding schedule, diaper changes, and nap times. She even pulled out a log sheet where she'd been recording everything: feedings, diaper changes, temperature readings, in careful handwriting. The social worker was particularly impressed by this level of organization. The girl had clearly been well trained and took her responsibilities seriously. Still, hospital protocol required verification of her story. The younger nurse had begun calling the numbers on the contact list. The first call went to voicemail. The baby's parents were likely still at the other hospital with their grandmother. The second call, to Mr. Wilson, was answered immediately. His gruff but kind voice confirmed every detail of the girl's story, adding praise for her quick thinking in recognizing the need for medical attention. While they waited for more calls to be returned, the baby began to show signs of hunger. Without being prompted, the girl reached into the diaper bag and pulled out a clean bottle and a container of pre-measured formula. She explained that she had packed extra supplies just in case they needed to stay at the hospital for a while. The older nurse watched in amazement as this 12-year-old efficiently prepared the bottle, checking the temperature with the same professional care she'd seen in many experienced parents. The baby accepted the bottle eagerly, tiny hands reaching up to touch the girl's fingers as she fed them. Around them, the atmosphere in the lobby had shifted. The initial suspicion had been replaced by something closer to admiration. Other patients who had been watching now smiled encouragingly at the girl, impressed by her capability and dedication. The social worker had stepped away to make some calls of her own, but she kept glancing back at the scene. In her line of work, she was used to expecting the worst, but sometimes situations surprised you in the best possible ways. The hospital staff continued their necessary protocols, but their approach had softened considerably. They could see now that this wasn't a case requiring intervention. Rather, it was an example of community care at its finest, where neighbors looked out for each other and young people were taught responsibility in meaningful ways. As they waited for further verification and medical attention, the girl remained focused on her charge, speaking softly to the baby, checking their temperature, and ensuring their comfort. Her maturity and compassion were a reminder that age doesn't always determine capability, and that appearances can be misleading in the most positive of ways. As the situation in the hospital lobby continued to unfold, the young girl's background story began emerging through conversations with hospital staff. While they waited for returned calls from the baby's parents, the social worker gently asked about the girl's family. What she learned painted a picture of an extraordinary household where responsibility and community service were valued above all else. The girl's mother, it turned out, wasn't just any nurse. She was a pediatric nurse with 15 years of experience who had trained many young nurses throughout her career. At home, she had applied the same careful teaching methods to her daughter. "My mom always says that knowing how to take care of others is one of the most important things we can learn," the girl explained, still cradling the baby expertly. "She started teaching me when I was really little, first with my dolls, then with my younger cousins." The social worker nodded encouragingly, noting how the girl's face lit up when talking about her family. "And what about your dad? What does he do?" The girl smiled proudly. "He runs the community center in our neighborhood. He's there right now, actually. That's why my mom arranged for me to watch the baby instead of him today." She adjusted the baby's blanket with one hand while continuing, "He teaches kids how to play basketball and helps older people learn to use computers. He says everybody has something to teach and something to learn." The older nurse, who had been listening while updating patient records, couldn't help but be impressed. It was clear that this young girl had grown up in an environment that emphasized both competence and compassion. The way she handled the baby wasn't just learned behavior, it was the result of careful mentoring and real-world experience. As they talked, more details about the girl's home life emerged. Their house had become something of a neighborhood hub where people often gathered for community meetings or simply to seek advice. Her mother offered free basic health education classes on weekends, teaching local parents about child care, first aid, and when to seek medical attention. Mom says knowledge shouldn't be kept secret, the girl explained, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone repeating an often heard family saying. She teaches anybody who wants to learn. Last month, she showed all the kids in my class how to check for fever and what to do if someone gets hurt on the playground. The baby had dozed off in her arms, but she continued to rock gently, a habit that seemed second nature to her. The social worker noted how she periodically checked the infant's temperature with the back of her hand against their forehead, just as an experienced caregiver would do. Tell us about your neighbors, the baby's family, the younger nurse prompted, genuinely interested now. The initial suspicion had completely given way to admiration for this young caregiver. The girl's face brightened. They moved in next door before I was born. Their grandmother, the one who fell today, she used to bake cookies for all the kids on our street. Her expression grew concerned as she mentioned the grandmother. I hope she's okay, she's really nice. She went on to describe how the two families had grown close over the years, sharing holidays and helping each other through difficult times. When the baby was born, it was her mother who had helped the new parents learn the basics of infant care. The families had dinner together at least once a week, and the girl had watched the baby grow from day one. It's like having a big extended family, she explained. Mom says that's how communities used to be everywhere, people looking out for each other, helping when needed. The wisdom in her words seemed far beyond her 12 years. The social worker was particularly struck by how the girl's upbringing had shaped her character. He was a child who had been given real responsibility, taught valuable skills, and shown through example how to care for others. It was a refreshing contrast to the many troubled cases she usually dealt with. As they waited, the girl told them about her school life too. She was in the 7th grade, maintaining honor roll status while also participating in the school's peer mentoring program. Dad says we should always try to balance books and people, she said, explaining her involvement in both academic and social activities. The baby stirred slightly, and the girl automatically checked the time. They usually need a diaper change about now, she said, reaching for the diaper bag. The nurses watched in amazement as she efficiently changed the baby's diaper on a nearby changing station, talking softly to the infant the whole time, her movements gentle but sure. Through all of this, she maintained a level of composure that would have been remarkable in someone twice her age. When the baby fussed, she had a solution ready. When questions were asked, she answered clearly and honestly. Every action showed the results of careful teaching and real understanding. The older nurse, who had initially been one of the most concerned, found herself reflecting on how quick they had all been to assume the worst. He was a perfect example of how appearances could be deceiving in the most positive way possible. The social worker's phone buzzed. A message from her supervisor about the background checks they had run. Everything the girl had said checked out perfectly. Her mother was indeed a respected pediatric nurse, her father a well-known community leader, and their home address matched exactly with what she had told them. As the afternoon light began to soften outside the hospital windows, the girl continued her careful attention to the baby, seemingly unaware of the impact she had made on everyone around her. Other patients in the waiting room who had witnessed the whole scene were smiling now, some nodding in approval, others quietly discussing how impressed they were with the young caregiver. The baby had begun to stir again, and the girl checked the temperature once more with the temporal thermometer. Her face showed concern as she read the numbers, but she remained calm, asking the nurse if they could please see a doctor soon. Her priority, as it had been from the moment she walked in, was solely the well-being of the child in her arms. This was the story of not just one remarkable young girl, but of a family and community that had done something increasingly rare in modern times. They had created an environment where children were taught real skills, given real responsibilities, and shown how to care for others with both competence and compassion. The atmosphere in the hospital lobby shifted dramatically when a doctor finally approached the reception area. The young girl sat up straighter, still carefully holding the baby, as the pediatrician introduced herself. The doctor's warm smile and gentle demeanor helped ease some of the tension that had built up during the wait. "I understand we have a little one with a fever," the doctor said, kneeling down to get eye level with the girl and the baby. "Can you tell me when you first noticed something wasn't right?" The girl nodded, her voice clear and confident as she began explaining the day's events. "I was following their normal schedule. They had their morning bottle at 10:30 and then went down for their nap at 11:15. She paused, shifting the baby slightly in her arms. "When they woke up around 12:30, they felt warm. That's when I took their temperature the first time." The doctor listened intently, noting how precise the girl's timeline was. As a pediatrician with over 20 years of experience, she was used to getting vague answers from adults, let alone children. But this young girl spoke with the accuracy of a trained caregiver. "The baby didn't finish their last bottle," the girl continued, worry creeping into her voice. "They usually eat really well, but this time they only took about half. That's when I decided we needed to come to the hospital." She reached into the diaper bag and pulled out a small notebook where she had recorded feeding times and amounts, temperature readings, and diaper changes. The doctor took the notebook, eyebrows raising as she reviewed the detailed logs. Each entry was time-stamped and clearly written, providing a thorough record of the baby's day. "This is incredibly helpful," she said, genuine admiration in her voice. "Many parents don't keep such detailed records." Just then, the baby began to fuss again, face scrunching up in discomfort. The young girl immediately responded, adjusting their position and gently patting their back. "They've been more irritable than usual," she explained. "Normally they smile a lot, but today they've been crying more." The doctor nodded, making notes in her chart. "You've done exactly the right thing by bringing them in," she assured the girl. "Would you be comfortable if we moved to an examination room now? We need to check the baby thoroughly." The girl stood up carefully, making sure to support the baby's head as she followed the doctor. The older nurse accompanied them, having decided to stay with this remarkable young caregiver until the parents arrived. As they walked down the corridor, other medical staff watched with interest. Word had spread through the hospital about the young girl who had shown such exceptional responsibility. In the examination room, the girl helped position the baby on the examination table, staying close to keep them calm. She answered the doctor's questions with remarkable detail: when the last feeding was, when the last diaper change occurred, how long the baby had slept, and what symptoms she had noticed. "The fever started at 101.3, she explained, "but it's gone up a little since then. I've been checking every 30 minutes like my mom taught me." She watched anxiously as the doctor performed her examination, her hand resting reassuringly on the baby's tummy. The doctor conducted a thorough checkup, explaining each step to both the girl and the baby in a gentle voice. "You know," she said while listening to the baby's chest, "in all my years of practice, I've rarely seen someone your age show such competence in childcare. Where did you learn all this?" The girl's face brightened slightly, despite her worry. "My mom's been teaching me since I was little. She says knowledge is like a gift. The more you share it, the more valuable it becomes." She watched as the doctor checked the baby's ears. "She makes sure I understand why we do things, not just how to do them." Just then, a nurse appeared at the door with news. They had finally reached the baby's parents. They were already on their way to the hospital, having just left their grandmother's bedside at the other medical center. The relief on the girl's face was evident, though she remained focused on the baby. The doctor finished her examination and turned to the girl with a reassuring smile. "It looks like we're dealing with an ear infection," she explained. "It's causing the fever and the discomfort, but it's very treatable. You did absolutely the right thing by bringing them in when you noticed the fever and change in feeding patterns." The young girl listened intently as the doctor explained the treatment plan. She asked thoughtful questions about the medicine that would be prescribed and how it should be administered. The doctor answered each question patiently, impressed by the girl's level of engagement and understanding. "Will they need to stay in the hospital?" the girl asked, concern evident in her voice. The doctor shook her head, explaining that with proper medication and care, the baby could go home once the parents arrived. As they waited for the parents, the girl maintained her careful attention to the baby's needs. When they became fussy, she knew exactly how to comfort them. When they needed a diaper change, she handled it efficiently. The medical staff watched in amazement as this young caregiver continued to demonstrate her exceptional skills. The older nurse, who had remained with them, couldn't help but reflect on how their initial suspicions had been so thoroughly disproven. What had started as a potentially alarming situation had turned into a powerful lesson about not judging by appearances and about the importance of community and proper mentoring. The doctor made one final check of the baby's temperature before preparing the prescription. "You know," she said to the girl, "you've probably inspired quite a few people today. It's not often we see someone so young showing such responsibility and care." The girl looked up, slightly surprised. She had been so focused on caring for the baby that she hadn't realized the impact she was having on those around her. "I was just doing what I was taught," she said simply, demonstrating once again the natural humility that made her actions even more impressive. As the afternoon light began to fade outside the hospital windows, the examination room had become more than just a medical space. It had become a place where prejudices were challenged and assumptions were proved wrong. Through the simple act of caring for a neighbor's child, this young girl had shown everyone present what true community spirit and responsibility looked like. The examination room fell quiet except for the soft cooing sounds the girl made to comfort the baby. The doctor had just left to prepare the prescription paperwork when rapid footsteps echoed down the hallway. Moments later, the baby's parents appeared in the doorway, their faces flushed from rushing and lined with worry. The mother burst into tears at the sight of her child, while the father stood frozen for a moment, taking in the scene before him. Their baby was calmly resting in the young girl's arms, looking peaceful despite the fever. The girl immediately stood up, carefully transferring the infant to its mother's eager arms. "We came as soon as we could," the father said, his voice thick with emotion. "Grandma's stable now, but when we got your message about the fever..." He trailed off, watching as his wife cradled their child, checking them over with anxious eyes. The girl spoke up quietly, reaching for her notebook. "I wrote down everything that happened today," she explained, handing it to the father. "The doctor says it's an ear infection. They've been running a fever since after their nap, but they took some bottles and had regular wet diapers." She pointed to her careful notes, showing the timeline of events. The mother looked up from examining her baby, tears still streaming down her face, but now they were tears of gratitude. "You took such good care of them," she whispered. "When we got the call about my mother, we were so worried about leaving the baby, but your mom assured us you were ready for this responsibility." The older nurse, who had stayed through the examination, watched as the young girl detailed everything that had happened. She explained the baby's symptoms, the decisions she had made, and the doctor's diagnosis and treatment plan. Her clear, confident voice showed no trace of the anxiety she must have felt earlier. "The prescription will be ready soon," the girl explained, picking up the diaper bag and organizing its contents. "The doctor said to make sure they get all the medicine, even if they start feeling better. And they need to come back in 3 days for a checkup." The father placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "You know, when we first moved to the neighborhood, some people questioned our choice to live in such a diverse area. But your family, you've shown us what true community means." His voice cracked slightly with emotion. "You've cared for our child like they were your own." The mother nodded in agreement, still holding her baby close. "Most adults wouldn't have handled this situation as well as you did. You noticed the fever, made the right decision to seek medical help, and kept such detailed records." She shook her head in amazement. "We can never thank you enough." The girl ducked her head slightly, embarrassed by the praise. "I just did what my mom taught me to do," she said simply. "She always says that taking care of babies is a big responsibility, and you have to pay attention to every little thing." The doctor returned with the prescription and care instructions, explaining everything to the parents while the girl quietly gathered her things. The baby had fallen asleep in its mother's arms, the fever finally starting to respond to the medication they had given earlier. As they prepared to leave, the father turned to the hospital staff who had been involved. "I hope you all realize what an exceptional young person you've met today," he said, his voice full of emotion. In a world where people are often quick to judge based on appearance or age, she showed what really matters: knowledge, responsibility, and compassion. The older nurse nodded in agreement. "We've certainly learned some valuable lessons today," she admitted. "Your daughter's maturity and capability have impressed everyone who encountered her." "Oh, she's not our daughter," the mother said softly, adjusting the sleeping baby in her arms. "But she might as well be, for how much she means to our family." She turned to the girl with tears in her eyes. "You're part of our family now, sweetheart. Always will be." The girl smiled, remembering all the Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations, and quiet moments they had shared. "Family isn't just about who you're born to," she said, repeating another of her mother's favorite sayings. "It's about who you choose to care for." The social worker, who had returned to check on the situation, overheard this exchange. In her line of work, she often saw the worst of human behavior, but occasionally she witnessed moments like this, moments that restored her faith in humanity's capacity for kindness and connection across all perceived barriers. As they walked toward the hospital exit, other patients and staff members who had witnessed the earlier scene smiled and nodded. The initial suspicion and concern had transformed into something beautiful, a testament to the power of community, proper mentoring, and looking beyond surface appearances. The father insisted on driving the girl home, while the mother sat in the back seat with the sleeping baby. The girl watched through the car window as the hospital grew smaller in the distance, thinking about how a day that started with a simple babysitting job had turned into something much more meaningful. Back at the hospital, the staff who had been involved gathered to discuss the day's events. The older nurse spoke for many when she said, "Sometimes our greatest teachers are the ones we least expect." Today, a 12-year-old girl taught us all something about responsibility, prejudice, and the true meaning of community care. The setting sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as the car disappeared around the corner, carrying home a family that had grown stronger through crisis, bound together by the actions of one remarkable young girl who had simply done what she had been taught was right. News of what had happened at the hospital spread quickly through the staff. During their break time, the nurses who had been involved in the incident gathered in the break room. Their conversation focused on the remarkable events that had unfolded. "You know," the older nurse said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, "in 30 years of nursing, I've never been so thoroughly schooled in the danger of making assumptions." Her colleagues nodded in agreement, each reflecting on their initial reactions when the young girl had first walked in with the baby. The head nurse called an impromptu staff meeting that evening. The waiting room was quiet now, and the day shift was preparing to hand over to the night staff. She felt it was important to use this experience as a teaching moment for the entire department. "Today, we witnessed something extraordinary," she began, looking around at her assembled staff. "What started as a potentially alarming situation turned into one of the most powerful lessons we could have received about prejudice and preconceptions." She went on to describe how the young girl had handled herself, her detailed record-keeping, her careful attention to the baby's needs, her clear communication with medical staff. "Many of our adult patients don't provide such thorough information," she pointed out. "This child showed us what real responsibility looks like." The security guard who had been present earlier spoke up. "I've been working hospital security for 15 years, he said. "Usually when we get called for situations like this, they don't end well. But today?" He shook his head in admiration. "Today showed me that sometimes what looks suspicious at first glance is actually something beautiful." The social worker had prepared a brief report about the incident, highlighting how proper community support and mentoring could create extraordinary outcomes. "What we saw today wasn't just about one capable young girl," she explained. "It was about a community that teaches its children real skills and trusts them with real responsibilities." The younger nurse who had initially pressed the security button shared her perspective. "I keep thinking about how quickly we jump to conclusions," she admitted. "We saw a young black girl with a white baby and immediately assumed the worst. But she showed us what real care looks like, no matter what age or color the caregiver is." As they discussed the day's events, the pediatrician who had treated the baby joined them. "In medical school, they teach us to look for signs and symptoms," she said. "But sometimes we need to be reminded to look beyond our initial impressions." That young girl provided better care and more detailed information than many adults I see. The conversation shifted to how they could use this experience to improve their own practices. The head nurse suggested implementing new training protocols about avoiding bias in emergency situations. "We need to remember that care and competence can come in any package," she emphasized. One of the administrative staff shared how the waiting room dynamics had changed throughout the incident. "It was fascinating to watch," she said. "People went from clutching their purses and giving suspicious looks to smiling and nodding in approval. It was like watching prejudice dissolve in real time." The hospital chaplain, who had observed part of the scene, offered his thoughts. "Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected teachers," he said quietly. Today, a child taught an entire hospital staff about compassion, competence, and the danger of jumping to conclusions. As the meeting continued, staff members shared their own experiences with prejudice and preconceptions in healthcare settings. The incident had opened up an important dialogue about how unconscious bias could affect patient care and professional relationships. The head of pediatrics made notes for future staff training sessions. "We need to document this case," she said. "Not the names or specific details, of course, but the lessons learned. This could be valuable teaching material for new staff orientation." The social worker agreed, adding that she planned to use this as an example in her community outreach programs. "This shows what's possible when we invest in teaching our young people and giving them real responsibilities," she explained. "It's about building community trust and capability." Outside the meeting room, the hospital continued its normal evening routine. Patients were being admitted, discharged, and cared for. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. Staff members found themselves being more mindful of their initial reactions, taking extra time to look beyond surface appearances. The nurses who had been directly involved in the incident updated their shift notes with unusual detail, wanting to ensure that this remarkable day was properly documented. They included not just the medical facts, but also their observations about how the young caregiver had handled the situation. As the evening shift took over, the story was passed along during handover. "You should have seen it," one nurse told her replacing colleague. "This young girl came in with more practical knowledge and better record-keeping than most parents we see. She completely changed how we think about capability and care." The security guard, finishing his shift, made a special note in his daily report. Instead of just recording the incident as a routine call, he detailed how it had transformed from a potential security concern into a powerful lesson about community and prejudice. In the pediatric ward, the doctor updated her teaching materials for medical students. She added a section about the importance of looking beyond initial impressions and recognizing that excellent care can come from unexpected sources. As the hospital settled into its quiet nighttime routine, the impact of the day's events continued to ripple through the building. Staff members found themselves reflecting on their own biases and assumptions, considering how they might approach similar situations differently in the future. The head nurse, finishing up her paperwork for the day, smiled as she thought about how one young girl had managed to teach an entire hospital staff more about care, responsibility, and prejudice than any formal training session could have done. Sometimes, she realized, the most powerful lessons come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. In the parking lot, the evening shift workers arriving for duty heard snippets of the story from their departing colleagues. By morning, the tale would have spread through every department, serving as a reminder that excellence in healthcare comes not from appearances or assumptions, but from knowledge, dedication, and genuine care for others. In the weeks that followed the hospital incident, the impact of that remarkable day continued to ripple through the community. The story had touched something deep in people's hearts, challenging their assumptions and inspiring new ways of thinking about responsibility, prejudice, and community care. At the hospital, changes were already visible. The head nurse had implemented new training protocols focused on recognizing and avoiding unconscious bias. During morning rounds, staff members would often reference that day when discussing patient care and first impressions. The young girl's mother, the pediatric nurse, was invited to speak at several hospital staff meetings. She shared her philosophy about teaching children real-world skills and responsibilities. "Every child has the potential to be extraordinary," she explained to the assembled medical staff. "They just need proper guidance and the chance to prove themselves." The community center, where the girl's father worked, saw an increase in attendance at their youth programs. Parents began asking about mentoring opportunities, wanting their own children to develop the same kind of capability and confidence. The father incorporated the hospital story into his talks about community building and trust. The baby's parents became vocal advocates for community integration and youth mentorship. They shared their story at local council meetings, describing how their preconceived notions about moving into a diverse neighborhood had been completely transformed by their experiences. One morning, about a month after the incident, the young girl arrived at school to find she had been nominated for a community service award. Her classmates had been inspired by her actions, and many had started volunteering at local daycare centers and community programs. The baby's recovery had been smooth thanks to the early detection of the ear infection. The two families grew even closer, with the young girl continuing to help with childcare. She had started teaching other neighborhood children the basics of baby care, passing on what she had learned from her mother. At the hospital, the staff had created a new recognition program called the Community Care Award, inspired by the young girl's actions. It celebrated instances of exceptional care that went beyond traditional medical training, recognizing that sometimes the best healthcare came from unexpected sources. The social worker who had been present that day used the story in her presentations at local schools. She emphasized how proper training and trust in young people could lead to extraordinary outcomes. The students listened intently, especially when she described how the young girl's detailed record-keeping had impressed even veteran medical professionals. The security guard who had witnessed everything that day changed his approach to potentially suspicious situations. He began taking more time to observe and understand before making judgments, and he encouraged his colleagues to do the same. In the neighborhood, the impact was perhaps most visible in the way people interacted with each other. Barriers that had once seemed insurmountable began to fade. Families of different backgrounds started community dinner gatherings, sharing meals and stories, learning from each other's experiences. The local newspaper ran a feature story about community youth programs, highlighting how proper mentoring could build bridges across cultural and racial divides. They interviewed several families who had been inspired to get more involved in neighborhood activities after hearing about the hospital incident. The young girl herself remained humble about the whole experience. When asked about it, she would simply say, "I just did what I was taught to do." But her actions had sparked something larger than she realized, a movement toward better understanding and cooperation in the community. At the hospital, the pediatric ward had undergone a subtle but significant transformation. The staff began paying more attention to young caregivers, recognizing that age wasn't always the best indicator of capability. They started offering youth first aid classes and basic childcare training, building on the lesson they had learned. The baby's grandmother, who had recovered from her fall, became one of the strongest advocates for community integration. She often told people how her grandchild had received the best possible care from someone many might have initially doubted, simply because of her age and appearance. The older nurse who had been present that day eventually developed a training module about unconscious bias in healthcare settings. She used the story as a central example, showing how quick judgments could cloud professional assessment and potentially affect patient care. In the school district, educators began incorporating more real-world responsibility into their programs. They recognized that children, when properly taught and trusted, could handle much more than adults often assumed. The community center started a new program called Young Caregivers, teaching basic childcare and first aid to interested youth. The waiting list grew quickly, as children and parents alike recognized the value of these practical skills. During community meetings, people often referenced that day at the hospital as a turning point, a moment when preconceptions were challenged and a new understanding began to emerge. It became a touchstone for discussions about trust, responsibility, and community building. As the seasons changed and time moved forward, the impact of that remarkable day continued to influence the community. What had started as a potentially suspicious situation had transformed into a powerful lesson about looking beyond surface appearances and recognizing the extraordinary potential in every person. The story became part of the community's shared history, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful teachers come in unexpected packages and that true care knows no boundaries of age, race, or background. It stood as testimony to what could happen when communities invested in their young people and gave them the chance to prove themselves. In the end, the greatest lesson wasn't just about childcare or medical attention. It was about the transformative power of trust, proper training, and looking beyond first impressions. The young girl's simple act of caring for a neighbor's baby had sparked a movement toward better understanding and cooperation that continued to grow and flourish in unexpected ways.